can't even afford a house. They laughed at the family conference. I smiled and said, I own the building you all live in. The room went silent. My name is Rachel, and in my family, I've always been the one people talk about when I leave the room. The one with no big house, no high-powered career, no sparkling ring on my finger. If you ask them, they'd probably say, I'm still figuring things out, like that's a polite way of calling me a failure. This Thanksgiving wasn't supposed to be any different. The moment I walked into my cousin's house, I felt the usual shift in energy. Polite smiles, quick glances, the kind of welcome you give someone who doesn't quite belong. I had brought sweet potato casserole still warm in the pan and placed it on the table like I hadn't just driven 2 hours with the windows cracked because my car heater's broken. Aunt Lisa was the first to notice my coat. "You're still wearing that thing?" she said, her eyes narrowing at the frayed sleeves. I smiled and nodded, not bothering to explain that it was a conscious choice, not a desperate one. I've learned they don't really want to understand. At dinner, I found my usual spot, tucked between the dining room and the hallway, close enough to join but far enough to be ignored. My cousins were swapping stories about ski trips and promotions. One of them just closed on a 5-bedroom in Scottsdale. Another bragged about a Tesla that parks itself. I sipped my water, listened, and kept quiet. Then it came. Uncle Rob, with a mouthful of turkey and a grin that never meant well, looked over and said, "So Rachel, any luck landing a real job this year?" There was laughter, but not from me. My fork froze mid-air. I laughed too soft and automatic, like I'd been trained to. I said something like, "Not yet," and moved on. But the words stuck. Real job. As if the work I've done for years coordinating outreach programs, helping underserved communities, wasn't real, because it didn't come with stock options or a glass office. As if my choices, my values were just code for failure. Later, my nephew leaned over and whispered, "Mom says you live in a box." He said it with the innocence only kids have, like he was asking why I didn't like cranberry sauce. I smiled again, patted his hand and said, "It's a nice box." But inside it hit harder than any adult's jab ever could. I've spent years swallowing moments like that, letting them pile up like snow you hope will melt on its own. Every year I'd come back and take my punches and leave with a smile so tight it hurt my cheeks. Not because I needed their approval, but because walking away would feel like admitting they were right. They think I have nothing. No mortgage, no marriage, no milestones. But they've never asked what I do or why I chose this life. They assume it's because I couldn't do better. They never considered that I didn't want what they had. The truth is, I've been patient. I've been building something they wouldn't understand, even if I tried to explain it. But tonight, something in me shifted. Not enough to make a scene, not yet. Just enough to sit a little straighter, to let their words settle without sinking in. I looked around that room at the people who claimed to know me, and I felt it clearly for the first time. They don't see me. They see a version of me they've created to make themselves feel better. And maybe I've let them. Maybe that's on me. But it won't always be like this. I'm not angry. Not really. I'm just done pretending their version of success is the only one that matters. I moved out when I was 22, a couple of weeks after college graduation. No one stopped me. No one offered advice or help, not really. I think they assumed I'd be back in a year, maybe 2, after the world knocked me around enough. But I found a small studio apartment in a neighborhood no one from my family would ever visit, and I made it mine. The floors creaked, the heater wheezed in winter, and the shower never really got hot. But it was quiet, and it was mine. I took a job with a local nonprofit that focused on community housing. The pay was low, the hours long, but every day felt like it mattered. I helped people who had nothing get just enough to start over. My family never asked what I did. Not once. They just knew it wasn't corporate, and that was enough to file me away as someone who never made it. I stopped trying to explain because I could see it didn't matter. While they bought newer cars and moved into bigger homes, I was learning. Nights and weekends I watched every video I could find on real estate. I read books about property tax loopholes and market cycles. I joined online forums and asked questions like I had something to prove. I didn't eat out. I didn't shop unless something wore through. I learned how to stretch $30 across 2 weeks, how to fix a leaky faucet on my own, and how to think long-term. They saw that as being broke. I saw it as laying a foundation. No one ever asked me why I didn't come home more often, or why I always seemed tired. They didn't ask because they assumed they already knew that I had failed, that I was lost, that I wasn't ambitious. What they didn't know is that I was saving every extra dollar. I was running the numbers on properties in up-and-coming zip codes. I was taking meetings with local agents on my lunch breaks, pretending to be scouting for a friend because I didn't want to admit how little I had. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt focused. I knew what I wanted, and I knew I'd have to do it without applause. That kind of work doesn't get recognition, not at first. It just looks like you're quiet and tired and falling behind. But I kept going. Every missed birthday party, every skipped holiday was another hour I spent working or learning or calculating. Not because I hated them, but because I knew they wouldn't understand the life I was building, unless they saw the end of it. They thought I'd given up. I hadn't. I'd just chosen a road they didn't believe in, and that made me invisible to them. But invisibility has its advantages. No one sees you coming. I bought my first duplex when I was 26. It was in a part of town most people avoided, the kind of neighborhood you only saw on the news when something went wrong. But I saw what others missed: new zoning laws, a light rail station planned 2 blocks away, and a grocery chain opening nearby. The down payment nearly drained my savings. I took out a loan with a higher interest rate than I wanted, but it was the only one I could get. The place was a mess, peeling paint, broken windows, outdated wiring, but I loved it instantly. I spent my weekends scraping walls, watching YouTube videos on drywall repair, and arguing with contractors who didn't take me seriously. Sometimes I cried in the middle of the night from exhaustion. Sometimes I felt like maybe my family was right about me after all. But then the front unit was ready, and I listed it. A young couple moved in that same week. When the first rent check cleared, I stared at my bank account like it was a miracle. I lived in the back unit for a while, fixing it up piece by piece. The kitchen floor took me 3 weekends. The plumbing under the sink nearly broke me, but every problem I solved made me stronger. After a year, I refinanced. With the equity, I bought another small property, this time a single-family home. I rented it out within days. From there, the pattern began to take shape. Buy, fix, rent, repeat. I kept my name off public records as much as I could. I created an LLC, then another. My tenants knew me as the property manager. My name stayed off the mailboxes. No one in my family had any idea. I still drove the same old car, still wore the same worn coat. At Thanksgiving, when they joked about how I never seemed to move forward, I smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. They had no clue that by 30, I was managing 4 properties. I knew how to write leases, screen tenants, and navigate eviction laws. That I had a spreadsheet tracking every dime I'd invested and every dime I planned to. There were setbacks. A burst pipe at midnight. A tenant who vanished mid-lease. A contractor who took my deposit and disappeared. But I handled it. I learned. I adapted. It was never about getting rich fast. It was about building something no one could take from me. Something I didn't need to post about or prove. I didn't tell my family because I didn't need their validation. I wanted peace. I wanted to move in silence, and I wanted to see how far I could go before they finally noticed I'd already arrived. It started with a question. My cousin's little boy Liam looked up at me with the kind of wide-eyed sincerity only kids have, and asked Aunt Rachel, "Why don't you have a real house like everyone else?" His voice was soft, curious, not cruel, but I felt every pair of eyes at the table lock on me like a target. Before I could answer, Uncle Rob chuckled. "Because she's still playing at being young and free," he said, slicing into his ham, like he hadn't just stabbed me. "Some people just don't grow up, I guess." There was a pause, just a beat, long enough for me to hope someone would speak up, but no one did. Not my mother, not my sister, not even Aunt Lisa, who once told me she admired my independence, though only when no one else was listening. Liam looked confused. "But she's old," he said, matter of fact, and laughter rippled down the table. I couldn't tell if it was at him or at me. I sat there, cheeks burning the walls of the dining room, suddenly too close. I wanted to disappear, or scream, or both. Instead, I forced a smile and looked down at my plate, The turkey was dry and my appetite had vanished. Then came the follow-up punch delivered casually by Aunt Lisa. Maybe, if you had stuck with that accounting thing, you'd be living somewhere nice by now. She reached for the rolls, like she hadn't just dismissed my entire adult life. That was when it happened. A shift. Not loud or dramatic, just a stillness inside me that hadn't been there before. I looked around that table and realized they were never going to see me, not the real me. They were too attached to the version they'd built a cautionary tale in a cardigan. All these years I'd swallowed their comments, smiled through their pity, convinced myself it wasn't worth the fight. I'd mistaken silence for peace, but it wasn't peace. It was dismissal wrapped in politeness. I thought about the nights I spent scrubbing paint off my hands, the weekends fixing plumbing with a flashlight between my teeth, the deals I closed, the tenants I helped, the quiet empire I was building while they laughed over casseroles. I took a sip of water, slow and steady, like I was buying time. But really, I was steadying something deeper. My breathing, my nerves, my resolve. They didn't know what was coming. And maybe finally I was ready to let them. I stood up without saying a word and walked to the hall closet where I had tucked away a slim leather folder, the same one they ignored when I came in too distracted by their own stories to ask what it was. I brought it back to the table, placed it next to the gravy boat, and looked at my uncle. "I think there's something you all should see," I said, voice steady, not raised. No one moved. I flipped open the folder and pulled out the documents. The first page was the deed. The second, the LLC ownership records. The third, a letter from the title company confirming the sale had closed 8 months earlier. I watched their faces shift, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally silence, so thick you could feel it settle in the air. "This house," I said quietly, "the one we're sitting in, the one you were all ready to sell last year when no one wanted to keep it, this house is mine." I let that land, then added, "Technically, it's owned by Red Maple Holdings." "But I own Red Maple." Aunt Lisa's mouth opened and closed. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. Uncle Rob blinked twice, like he was trying to wake up from a dream. No one said anything. "I bought it to keep it in the family," I continued, "because Grandma and Grandpa built this place with their hands, and while the rest of you were debating who could get the most money for it, I was finding a way to save it." They didn't know what to say. They looked at each other, then back at me, like maybe I'd rehearsed a prank, and the real punchline was coming. But it wasn't. When you sold it, you didn't check who was behind the LLC. You just signed, took the cash, walked away. I shrugged, not with arrogance, but finality. "And now, you're all my tenants." That last sentence cut through whatever was left of the evening. It wasn't said with spite, just truth. Simple. Unapologetic. They had written me off so completely that it never occurred to them I might be capable of something like this, that I might care more about legacy than leverage, that I could outmaneuver them without ever raising my voice. I didn't want revenge, I wanted preservation. But somewhere along the way, the two became the same. I sat back down and took a bite of my casserole. No one spoke for a long time. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like mine. No one spoke for a long time. The air in the dining room felt heavier than it had ever been, like all the oxygen had been replaced by quiet shame. Eyes dropped to plates, hands fiddled with napkins, and the only sound was the slow ticking of the old kitchen clock. My mother was the first to say something. "Rachel, why didn't you tell us?" Her voice was small, almost brittle, like she already knew the answer, but needed to hear it anyway. I looked at her and gave a small smile. "Because no one ever asked," I said. And that was the truth. Over the years, they'd decided who I was, and nothing I said would have changed that. Uncle Rob cleared his throat and mumbled an apology. It was clumsy and barely audible, but I let it pass. I wasn't there for apologies. I was there to reclaim my space. I had stayed quiet for a reason. I never wanted my life to become some kind of scoreboard. I didn't need them to cheer for me, and I wasn't looking to prove anything. I just wanted to preserve the one thing that still felt like home, my grandparents' house. When the family agreed to sell it, I felt like something sacred was about to be erased. So I stepped in quietly and did what none of them thought I could. I bought it back before it could become another teardown with a for sale sign and a granite countertop kitchen. I never cared about being the richest in the room. I cared about what this house meant. The back porch where Grandpa used to drink coffee. The handprints are still pressed into the concrete near the garden bed. The echoes of every holiday, every story, every memory. I could have kicked them out. Legally, I had every right, but I didn't. Not because I was trying to be noble, but because I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in change, so I set a few new terms. If they wanted to continue living here, it would be under a lease just like any other tenant. Market rate. No more assumptions. No more unspoken debts. And beyond that, if they wanted to be in my life, they'd have to start treating me like a person, not a placeholder for their projections. I made it clear this wasn't about money. It was about respect, about boundaries, about not pretending anymore. Some of them agreed quickly, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of fear. A few left early that night, too embarrassed to stay. I didn't chase them. I had no interest in managing anyone else's discomfort. What surprised me most was the relief I felt. I had braced for anger, resentment, even more judgment. But when the silence settled and the truth stood bare, all I felt was light. Like I'd been carrying something invisible for years and finally put it down. I didn't need their approval. I never did. What I needed was to stop shrinking myself so they could feel tall. After dinner, I walked through the house alone. The lights were low, the dishes still in the sink, and the sound of muffled voices behind closed doors. I paused in the hallway and ran my hand along the wall, right where Grandpa had patched the plaster back in '94. It wasn't perfect, but it had held. That's what this house was to me. Not perfect, but strong, worth saving, just like me. The next morning, I woke up to texts. Some apologizing, some are thanking me. One from Aunt Lisa asking about a clause in the lease. I responded with kindness, but not softness. There's a difference. I've changed, not into someone else, but into more of who I always was, the version of me they refused to see, and now they don't have a choice. This isn't revenge, it's resolution. It's the moment I stopped asking to be understood and started demanding to be respected. And it feels like freedom. I'm not telling this story because I want praise or validation. I'm telling it because I know what it feels like to be talked over, to be sized up by people who think they already know your limits. I know what it's like to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. For years I stayed quiet because I thought that was the mature thing to do. I thought if I kept my head down and focused on my goals, eventually the truth would speak for itself. And in a way it did, but not without some bruises along the way. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's a strategy. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's the only way to build something real without the noise and the expectations clouding your vision. I've learned that you don't need to explain your every move. You don't have to defend your path or convince anyone it's the right one. Let them think what they want. Just keep going. Playing the long game isn't glamorous. It's lonely. It takes patience and a thick skin. But it also gives you a kind of clarity you can't get when you're chasing quick wins. People like to think power comes from being loud, from taking up space, from proving your worth with words and symbols. But the kind of power that lasts, the kind that changes everything, comes from knowing who you are and acting on it even when no one's watching. I didn't flip the table that night at Thanksgiving. I didn't scream or cry or demand anything. I just told the truth. I showed my work, and I let the silence do the rest. There's a quiet kind of revenge in that. Not the spiteful kind, the healing kind, the kind that doesn't hurt anyone but still makes everything clear. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to know you're not alone. If they've written you off, boxed you in, or turned you into a joke, hold on. Your story isn't over. You are not defined by what they see. One day you'll have your moment. It may not come to the dinner table. It might not involve deeds and signatures, but it will come. And when it does, you won't need to shout. You'll just stand still, speak your truth, and watch everything shift. That moment won't fix everything, but it will change something in you. It will remind you that you never needed permission to be powerful. You only needed the time and space to grow. So now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Because if you have, I hope you remember this. You are not what they say you are. You are who you choose to become.